So where we are is with Joseph in the 40th chapter. He's gone through all of this, and chapter 40, verse 1, sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker offended their lord the king of Egypt, and he threw them into jail, and then they had their dreams, and then Joseph was also in custody there, and he interprets their dreams, and then he tells them to remember him, the cupbearer, because he survives, and he's sent back to Pharaoh, and he says, "Mention me to Pharaoh, so that you will get me out of this place, for in fact I was stolen out of the land of my home." And then the baker forgets, and then over in chapter 41, it says, after 2 whole years, Pharaoh has some dreams, standing by the Nile, and there came up out of the Nile 7 sleek and fat cows, and they grazed on the reed grass, and then 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile, and the ugly thin cows ate up the 7 sleek fat cows, and Pharaoh awoke. And then he fell asleep and dreamed a second dream. 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk, and then 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind, sprouted after them, and the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump, full ears. And Pharaoh woke up, and it was a dream. And in the morning his spirit was troubled, so he sent and called for the magicians of Egypt, the Magi, and their wise men and soothsayers and all of that, all these people, and none of them could interpret the dream for him. And then the cupbearer finally remembers Joseph, and he tells him, Pharaoh, about him, and they sent for him, got him all washed up and cleaned, and he went into Pharaoh and was able to hear these dreams all over again. And then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "Pharaoh's dreams are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good grains are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears are blighted by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown the Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout the land of Egypt, and after them there will arise 7 years of famine. And of all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will consume the land." Anyway, he makes suggestions, and then the Pharaoh says, "Well, you sound like the man to take over and do that job, so I'll make you second in command to me. You'll be the second most powerful person in Egypt, and you'll take care of rescuing us from this great, terrible thing that's about to come." So, we went over a lot of the detail of that earlier, but one of the things in Rabbi Jonathan Sachs' book, he has some interesting reflections from the Hebrew perspective, but basically a review that this story is written on 2 levels. The whole Joseph story has 2 levels. The first is the most obvious, and that is the level of a family of brothers, human beings, and their normal and common relationships of sibling rivalries and power struggles. They have hopes and dreams, and hopes are dashed on the rocks of reality, of treachery and dishonor, creating heartache and sorrow. And the second level is that there is some other force working over and under and through this first level of these human interactions of everyday life, and that something is God monitoring the events and arranging strategic interventions to ensure that the outcome will result as God plans, that God has a long-range arching plan. And so that theme is one of level of the stories, but this subtle weaving of apparent happenstance with the divinely scripted destiny. Now, Rabbi Sachs says that Joseph's story is a human story. It is like each one of our stories. For each of us are at best co-authors of our lives, meaning we make decisions that affect our future. But there are other things that happen that we have no control. They happen. And in spite of our best plans and objectives, things change. And so, but if we hadn't made our decisions and done the things that we do, then things would have happened differently also. So, anyway, not realizing it at the time, the very act of Joseph's brothers to prevent his dreams from coming true become the first step in making them come true. Because if they hadn't sold him into slavery or hadn't done what they had done, he would still be out there herding sheep. He never could have gotten down to be in Egypt and to have them come bow down to him the way his dream pictured it. So often people fear that something bad will happen and they react out of fear, and then they do something foolish that then actually makes what they feared happen. Anybody have a testimony of how you did that sometime? I've done it in the kitchen. I'm afraid I'm going to spill something, and so I'm so very careful, and then the very thing I do, I mess up and I spill it. I can't remember exactly how it happened. I can just remember cleaning things up and kicking myself. How could I do that? I was trying to make it not happen. Anyway, there's another one. Let's say the boy-girl relationship. And let's say this guy is so afraid that he might lose this girl because she is so beautiful and he doesn't feel worthy. And he's so worried and jealous that he becomes very obsessive and controlling. And he makes happen the very thing he's afraid of because she doesn't like it and he loses her. He causes the very thing he was afraid of because of what he did. Well, Sachs believes providence exists, but we only know it in retrospect. We never know for sure in the present, at the moment of making decisions and choices, of how things will turn out. But in addition to our own initiative and our enterprise, we also need patience and humility and trust. So as we pray for wisdom and guidance for the answers to what we should do, for the solutions to whatever problems are ahead of us, we do need to do our part and have faith and trust in the other part that God is doing God's part, and that in God's good time and in God's way, things will work out for the good. Now, that doesn't mean bad stuff won't happen in between, but the sense of we do the best we can with what we've got, and we trust that God somehow, some way is out there and going to help things come out good. It may not be the way we perceive it or think it's going to be or want it to be, but anyway, that's a faith dimension that Sachs is pointing toward. So what he's saying is we are not the sole masters of our fate. He concludes his essay on this theme by saying that we just need to relax, rest in God's love, and make space in our minds for these things that aren't under our control. And he says, in that space that we make in our minds for things to kind of happen that we don't have control over, he says that space is faith. So we have a lot of ways of defining faith, but this is another dimension to faith, is the relaxing and trusting that we can't make everything work out the way we want it to or think it should, but rest and relax a little bit and trust that somehow God is here and with us, and it's going to come out okay, in spite of some of the bad stuff that may intervene. But anyway, that's one of Rabbi Sacks's essays. That's kind of a sermon. Now, a lot of people of faith traditions try to define faith as things that we have to believe. Faith, in some traditions, the definition of faith is believing. You have to believe certain things, and you have to believe them without a question of doubt. Because if you doubt, then that means you lose your faith and you're going to go to hell in some of those traditions that are so strong in that attitude. But the faith that Sacks is indicating is a faith that steps into the unknown. You cannot know the future for certain. It's not a believing in a particular something. It's not a belief that something in the past has happened, literally as recorded in the Bible, but rather faith has more to do with the decisions in the present, relying on belief, trust, and hope that God will be with us as we move into the future, to act upon that decision that we're making in the present. And it's a trusting that what we've learned from the past is helping us now make the good and the right decision for the future. And that's what the believing in the past is secondary to the most important part of having faith to make that decision and step with faith into the future. Now, we're not to Moses yet, but one of the rabbis at Clergy Institute over at Temple Israel had an interesting of the rabbis' interpretations, their little stories, the Midrash and Haggadah about biblical texts. It's not in the Bible, but when Moses is parting the Red Sea or the Sea of Reeds, nothing happens until one of those Israelites puts his foot in the water and starts across. And as soon as that act of faith happens, then God's power is released. Anyway, it's not in the Bible, but that's the rabbi's interpretation, that the most important part of faith is stepping out in faith with that decision, not knowing for certain, but trusting. Anyway, we remember on that theme, Abraham did not have a set of doctrines and beliefs that he had to ascribe to. He was just given the command, go where I will lead you and show you. And he's the father of our faith, or the Hebrew faith. So that's the emphasis in that essay. Now, the second essay that Sacks was writing about this is that a struggling between freedom and providence. And this it's still on the same area, freedom and providence. So if God is guiding us and leading us and involved, then how much control does God have over our lives? And then how much difference does our decision make? How much freedom do we really have? Where's the balance? Where does it tip? And he says, much in my life is my own. I'm totally free to choose and to be. But how much is controlled or influenced by outside influences? Fate or genetics? Anybody been to the doctor and now you've been diagnosed with something and it's not because you didn't eat right or exercise right, it's just a congenital condition. You were born with it. It's just now manifesting at a certain time. How much parental or societal conditioning, the pre-programming that has made us the way we are. And, we have this issue that's kind of come up around that advanced placement history has hit hit the news. What should be taught? What kind of conditioning should we place upon our young people? And the difference between learning really good critical thinking and taking the facts and making good decisions, but then how much should be pre-programmed, the patriotism or blind obedience to authority, that if you program that in education, because on the one hand, church tradition, cultural traditions are passed on from one generation to the other. They have to be taught. They have to be learned. They have to be appreciated. Art appreciation. But anyway, there's a danger of going too far with that. You remember Nazism relied upon the German idea of exceptionalism. We've got American exceptionalism, but you know what the German exceptionalism was? They're a master race. And that was the whole focus. If you just want to change the wording, it's the same concept. Exceptionalism. Now, if you push it too hard, then, as they did, then it is blind obedience to the authority figures. And to the Führer and loyalty to the fatherland. Now, the irony of this debate that's been going on is that the exceptionalism of the United States is that process of self-critical analysis. Self-critical analysis of our past and of our present so that we can improve and adjust to the changing influences in the real world and not a glorified mythical past, in order to make ourselves better and stronger for the future challenges that are coming. Now, anyway, if we're going to make best decisions moving forward into the future, trying to ignore and deny or censor the unpleasant truths about ourselves or about our history is setting ourselves up for bad decisions and some disasters. And if we're only trying to justify or whitewash our sins and weaknesses and failures, then how can we face them and confess them and correct them? Anybody here for first service? Wasn't that what David's sermon was about? Looking at the skeletons in our closet to, face them and overcome them. I remember Muzan, I can't remember if it was Muzan but I think it was Muzan. He used to be on the jurisdictional committee that would go interview bishops when we had to elect a new bishop and do the politicking and try to get us the best bishop. That there was one bishop that came before them, and the committee had a question for all of the bishops that they were interviewing. And that question was, can you tell us about one mistake that you had made and what you learned from it? And each of them, had one, but this one bishop just said, I haven't made any mistakes. You know how many conferences wanted that man? 0. Nobody wanted that man. But anyway, it was this whole idea of we need to have the humility to be self-critical if we're going to improve and continue to do well. But it also leads to an issue that justice delayed is better than justice denied. That if we don't see our errors and correct them, that we will end up with situations where things explode. And justice delayed can bring about reconciliation, but justice denied will bring revolution or anarchy. But anyway, this question between freedom and providence, Sachs points out that the change from a lost and forgotten Joseph who's anguishing in prison, that's where he is. He's in prison. He's lost, he's forgotten, And then the story sounds like a day, he becomes second in command of this great nation, Egypt. So this freedom, and providence, it's kind of ironic. He's locked up in prison and we're talking about freedom. But they recognized that he was so gifted that he is immediately raised to such a high station just overnight. But Sachs expresses this new job as the world's first economist. Anybody read a commentary that called Joseph the world's first economist? Well, it would fit in Genesis, the book of first things, and that he would be called the first something, but the first economist. And but he diagnoses a problem, a coming problem, and he plans a preemptive solution. He recognized through divine revelation, the story tells us, and he would say, as he said, not me, but God is revealing this. But Joseph recognizes weather and climate cycles and that things are good now, but a big reversal is coming, drought and famine. So let us prepare with storing up surplus in the good years and to be ready for the years of scarcity of the lean years. Well, I guess the point is that's an economist. How do you deal with managing your produce and the buying and the selling and so forth? Sachs points out a detail we often overlook, and that, although the text will say it, that it's not just one dream, but there are two dreams. There are two dreams. There's the cows and then there's the grain that Pharaoh has. And these two dreams are about one meaning, but two different dreams. And the biblical literature points out that when there's two dreams, that's not a fluke or an anomaly, but it's telling us it's a divine revelation because, well, it doesn't give a because, but usually it's because God has such a hard time getting our attention that he has to repeat himself. But anyway, but the idea there is it is a divine revelation of God's firm intent that this will happen, and it will happen soon. So looking at a small picture view with a narrow view, the two dreams are only about Egypt and Egypt's immediate short-term future. And that is the content of the story. However, to the biblical writers and their audience, the bigger picture with the broader view is this is only one little episode in the longer story of Joseph and the even longer story of their people. It's not just about one event or crisis in the life of the people of Egypt, but it's their story that just coincidentally has to draw in Egypt for the place that it takes place. So we see a connection also with another pair of dreams, Sachs tells us, Joseph's two dreams. So Pharaoh has two dreams, we remember. Well, Joseph had two dreams. And his were differing images, but they had the very same message as well, that about the future that would come to pass. The sheaves of wheat, interesting that it's wheat because Joseph was a shepherd. They weren't raising wheat, but that wheat image came into his dream, that all the brothers' sheaves would bow down to his, and the sun and the moon and the stars bowing down to Joseph is also, if we project, that this is an image of a global, international kind of significance, that it is not just within the family, but this is really big if we're going to use images of sun and stars and moon in the image. So, at the time that we're reading the dreams and hearing them early in the story, it just sounds like this is the fruit of a fevered imagination of an overly indulged an overly ambitious young man or teenager who's out of touch with reality and all full of himself. But when we look back to Joseph's dreams from the point of view and perspective of his rise to power, then we see those dreams in a different light. Of course, a great prophecy. The problem for us is we've heard the story so often, so whenever we go back and read it, we already know the end of the story, and so we don't get that first kind of glance. But anyway, so Sachs tells us it is only in the retrospect that we can understand the story of our own lives. The later events explain earlier ones. In the case of Joseph, this retrospect, looking back, one sees that Joseph's dreams were a prophecy, but one also sees that each of the terrible misfortunes that he would suffer not only played a part in the dreams coming true, but each misfortune did prepare him and condition him for his great success when the time was right and the providence unfolded. All of those things. If he had, still been that snot-nosed little teenager who was so full of himself and jumped right over to the Pharaoh appointing him to this important job, he would have failed miserably. But all of those conditions leading up to it, he had gained wisdom and insight. And he probably learned how to work with people. I mean, if he's going to lead people in this great undertaking, then he needed to know how to talk to people and communicate and help them understand and get them on board with the plan, so that they didn't oppose him in every step of the way, and not allow it to work. But anyway, going through this is, and also the fact that I'm going to try to get away, but this June is going to be my 50th reunion of my graduating class from high school. And then it had me reflecting on high school and college and all the events that happened and all, and just thinking how different things would have been if things happened differently. And so anyway, it's an interesting process of thinking about this, looking back, and which things might have been providential, and some hurtful things and some disappointing things that, if they had gone the other way, may have sent me on an entirely different path that would have been, who knows? God only knows. That's who knows. But anyway, it's and that's what Sachs is saying for all of us. When we look back in retrospect and examine some of the events of our lives and realize how critical that was in how things have turned out to where we are, and sometimes are we the right person and the right time and the right place? Well, sometimes that depends upon the decision we make today about responding to something that's happening right now. And are we bringing all of that and making us that right person at the right place at the right time? Anyway, how much is freedom and how much is providence is what Sachs is raising that issue. So we see that, looking back, that a boy from a nomadic family of shepherds in the Palestinian area to becoming this viceroy over all of Egypt, a great world power in antiquity. What are the chances of that happening? I mean, it just kind of blows one's mind. Anyway, so this is the truth for all of us, not just exceptional individuals, Sachs says. We live our lives poised between a known past and an unknown future, and we make decisions every day. But the important point when he says that is the link between the known past and the unknown future is the present, and that's obvious, but he goes on to emphasize that it is in the present that we make decisions and choices in our life, and there are always different options and divergent paths before us, and we have to choose which path to follow. And when we look back on our lives in later years, do they take on the nature of a story? And we can kind of judge or discern which of those decisions and choices, which were major events, and there may be some that thrust us upon a path, and the way we responded made all the difference. The events we didn't choose, but how we responded when they came into our lives was the important thing. So it is in retrospect that we realize that some issues that seem so important and really big deals now seem irrelevant. It's kind of hard to tell teenagers that or young adults that sometimes. But while sometimes very small things in our past judgments turned out to be the biggest thing that charted that course. So looking back through the eyes of faith, we try to discern which of those events and which of those decisions that we thought were free will, but really which ones had a divine influence, touching or guiding or nudging us. And it's only in retrospect that we can discern that that was probably the case. Now, it's the free will or the predestination question that Christianity would lay upon this issue. If God knows exactly what we're going to choose, how can we be free to choose something different? If God knew we were going to do that, then did we really have freedom in that moment? What do you think? Anybody have a strong feeling about that? You worked out that? Anybody had to write a paper about this in Introduction to Philosophy? Anyone had an argument about it in Sunday school anytime? But then how is it free if God already knows? Oh, well, that's a part of the answer, and it goes to the nature of God. If God is eternal, then God can look at events from any perspective, and God can see from way out infinity from the future looking back. But when we're in the moment, we are free. But if Sachs gives this example to try to explain it and illustrate it, is that if you're watching an athletic event and you're in the stadium and you're watching how the play emerges and the players on the field are having to make snap decisions, you know, like football game, is it a run or is it a pass? So if the backfield think it's a run, they come up to tackle the runner, but if it's a fake, you know, the quarterback fakes a handoff and then throws a pass, and if you're the backfield defense and you fall for the fake or you don't fall, you have a decision in that moment. Anyway, but you're watching, and you don't know at the moment you're watching, is he going to go for the fake or is he, you know, what's going to happen? But the game's filmed. You go home and you watch the replay. Remember in the olden days when Bud Wilkinson used to have the replays of the OU game and they'd talk about it, and you know they'd cut out the huddle so they could get it all in. But anyway, but you know, if you were at the game, you know what was going to happen, and that's why you watched the replay. You wanted to see that over again. But anyway, what Sachs is saying, just because you know what's going to happen in the film, at the time it was happening, those players had the freedom of choice to make the right choice or wrong choices. Does that help? Anyway, it's kind of a philosophical issue, and we debate with Calvinists who often will say that there's predestination. God already knows who's going to be saved and who's not going to be saved, and so because that's already a given, then we don't have to care about the ones that are lost because God's already judged them, and so why bother with them? And we argue with that. But there's another way of looking at that free will and God already knowing what we're going to do, and this is a process theology one that Schnitzer likes to dabble in, and that is that there are, in God's infinite wisdom, not only does God know the choices that one would make, but God knows all the possibilities. And in knowing all the possibilities, then we still have freedom because we could have chosen different possibilities. There's a children's book. I've seen it, and I haven't really read it because it came out after I was reading children's books, and my boys were old enough to read it themselves. But the book works this way. The author had written that you get to a point in the book, and the character has a choice. And if you think the character should take choice A, it'll say, well, keep reading. If you think the character should make choice B, turn over to page something, and the story will continue from there. Well, anyway, that is the process theology way of answering how can we have freedom of choice if God already knows and it's already determined what's going to happen. The problem is we don't know, and we still have to make the decisions, but it's an interesting thing to try to wrap our minds around that sort of thing. But anyway, when we are faced with that, we have to continue to try to discern what God wants from us and what God's will and plan is for our lives and for the life of the world. And we want to be on God's side and on God's within God's plan. Another part of this was my 9th grade Sunday school teacher who didn't know process theology, but she taught us something that would fit right into the process theology way of reasoning. When she asked us this question to discuss in our Sunday school class as 9th graders, if God called you to do something, if God was laying it upon your heart that you needed to do this important thing, and right now we're thinking about with Selma and Martin Luther King Jr., if Martin Luther King Jr. had said, I feel God's calling me to this ministry and mission, but I can't do it, what would have happened? Would we still... God... Yeah. Yeah. No. Exactly. That was our teacher's answer, that God is calling you to do that. But if you don't respond, your failure to respond will not stop God's plan or God's influence. Into that vacuum, someone else may step. Now, if God called you first, then that means you're probably the best one to do that most effectively and successfully, and the someone else might not do it as well, but it'll get done. And that was the message. Now, in the 9th grade was when I first felt my kind of nudge or call to ministry, so I was paying pretty close attention to this question, and it's probably why I remembered it. So that's a situation that a lot of us are called upon, that sometimes things may not happen the way they should at a given moment, but they may eventually get taken care of. A lot of it is, there are a lot of injustices and a lot of things are wrong, and a lot of folks don't want to get involved, and people won't speak up and deal with situations. And in order to do something, that a lot of times folks will remain silent. And there's a lot of cop shows where young women have been raped, but they won't come forward, and then that allows that a rapist to continue to hurt other people. And so, anyway, there are situations like eventually somebody's going to stop it, but if only someone had the courage to step forward earlier and say no to this, or this is wrong, and call it out for what it is, then God's will could work sooner and more effectively, is possibly. So anyway, this is what Sachs is trying to point out in the middle of this freedom and God's providence and being called or not called to do things. But another thing that Sunday school teacher told me told us, maybe she just told me, but it's another one of those things that stuck in my mind. She said, one of the saddest, it's the only thing sadder than a preacher who is not really called to the ministry is a preacher who was called but didn't answer that call. And then Art McGrew on this line told a story. He was kind of talking about himself at one time, but he said, had a vision. I saw the letters PC. PC is a farmer, and he saw a vision, PC, and he knew it meant preach Christ. And he had a miserable ministry. And finally he realized PC meant plant corn. If you think that's irreverent, you can tell Art you didn't like but anyway, it's along that same line of that freedom and providence and that sense of calling and purpose that we all wrestle with at different times. It doesn't have to be the big ones of a life calling, but what am I called to do that's moral and just in this moment as some situation presents itself. So anyway, it's a part of our sensing that we have a meaningful, purposeful life, and to see that our work in some way benefits others and benefits the community at large, and somehow what we do does serve the greater good that supports and enhances the quality of life for others, which is God's wanting all people to be blessed. So as a religious or Christian person, we could not feel right if our prosperity came from unjust treatment of our employees, or if our product was an unsafe one for customers, or our plant polluted the air and water of our community and caused cancer and asthma and lung disease in innocent children and youth downstream or downwind. That's why our church's investment in the ministers' pension funds do not include alcohol and tobacco or production of guns that are used, or the gun manufacturers that so often are used in loss of human life. We won't invest in gambling casinos. Now, even though, and this one has become a little bit difficult for us because we've got our Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference here in Oklahoma, and a lot of the gaming industry is putting a lot of people to work, and the profits that come for that are helping in so many ways, but it puts us in an awkward position because we really don't think gambling is good for people. Anybody know why our fundamental...
So I can have it, knowing that I probably will lose what I have, but I'm greedy enough to try to do it anyway. Does this make any sense?
Yes, you're pretty much right on target. The moral issue in gambling is that for me to win, a whole lot of other people have to lose. In other businesses, there is an exchange of goods or services for the money that I will give, and it's a win-win. But for gambling, it's win, lose, 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 lose. And morally, the judgment is that's not healthy for me to get a bunch of money at the cost of others losing, and the fact that a lot of those losing for me to get the chance to win become addicted. And then they've squandered their money and it hurts their family. And so that's the moral thing. It doesn't mean that someone who has fun and it's a recreational thing and they know how to discipline themselves and say, well, I'd spend the same money going to, to a movie or dinner or, a vacation or something. I enjoy it. This is the way and they don't get addicted. They're not an evil, sinful person, but for the church to make a stand or support or use our pension money investing in that kind of a business, we feel is not healthy or proper or the best way to go. So anyway, that's how come that happened. So we have to make decisions and have the freedom to make decisions, but we're supposed to look at what does God want us to do. Anyway, so that gambling issue creates some problems here for Oklahoma Methodists as we deal with that. So how do we discern God's will, God's calling in the present as it relates to our decision about the future? And it's interesting that the Pharisees had a belief about that. If everyone could come into perfect obedience to God's will at one moment in one time, then that would unlock the door or the gates of heaven, and the kingdom of God would come rushing in. If we could get everyone in 1 second to be in perfect obedience to God's will, then the kingdom of God would come. And that's why they were so picky about all these little things and wanting everybody to conform, so that if we could have on World Communion Sunday everybody to come to church and to kneel at the altar and receive communion and confess their sins all on one day, or maybe get everybody to say the Lord's Prayer. But it would fall apart as soon as we got to trespasses, debts, because we weren't all together. But it's a concept of that they were trying to force with legalism. But in Jesus' mind, it seems that the kingdom of God is present when people do obey and follow God's will and love each other and care for each other and treat one another with justice and kindness. And when that happens, indeed, the kingdom is present in that place, in that moment. And in our life journey, we want to make as many good decisions, doing the right thing, and filling